Sitting at that long, polished mahogany table while watching my own family prepare to erase my existence was a moment of clarity that no amount of data analysis could ever have provided. My name is Eleanor Sterling. I am 32 years old, and for the last decade, I have built a career as a senior systems analyst in Chicago, far away from the stifling expectations of my high society family in Savannah. The air in the room felt heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and the cold, clinical finality of a legal proceeding that was designed to crown one sibling while burying the other. My mother leaned forward with a smile that never reached her eyes, sliding a heavy stack of documents across the wood toward my older brother Julian Sterling with a flourish that felt like a physical slap to my face. She announced that Julian would be receiving $45 million from the main estate, a sum so massive it seemed to vibrate in the silent room. When my father, Richard Sterling, turned his gaze toward me, there was no warmth or hesitation, only a flat indifference, as he told me that I should go out and earn my own way because Grandpa Silas didn't want me to have a single cent. He claimed that I had chosen my career over my family, and that my absence during Silas's final months was proof enough that I deserved absolutely nothing from the Sterling legacy. Just as Julian began to reach for the pen to sign his future into existence, the side door opened, and my grandfather's private attorney, Daniel Park, stepped inside with a sealed black envelope and a look of grim determination that signaled a reckoning none of them had anticipated. Have you ever sat there while your own family decided you were worth nothing and wondered if you should walk away or wait to hear the one secret that could blow everything apart? Before we continue with my story, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see just how far my journey has traveled across the world. If you believe that justice should always prevail over greed, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below to help me share this reckoning with others. The silence that followed the appearance of the black envelope allowed the ghosts of my childhood to rush back into the room, filling the spaces between the heavy furniture with the suffocating weight of decades of neglect. Looking at my brother Julian as he clutched those $45 million documents made me recall a summer afternoon when we were children on the manicured lawn of our estate. My mother, Margaret Sterling, had been filming Julian as he scored a goal in a local youth soccer match, her face glowing with a pride she never directed toward anyone else. She was so consumed with capturing his minor triumph for her social circle that she completely ignored me, standing 10 feet away, holding a trophy I had just won at the Regional Mathematics Olympiad. My father, Richard Sterling, had clapped until his hands were red for Julian, but when I tried to show him my certificate of achievement, he told me to put it away, because we were celebrating a real victory. That was the persistent, aching pattern of our existence together, a world where Julian's loud and often mediocre accomplishments were treated like priceless gold, while my quiet, hard-earned successes were treated like inconvenient clutter. My mother constantly reminded me that I was too intense and too focused on things that didn't matter, suggesting that my fascination with systems and logic was a personality flaw that needed to be corrected. She wanted a daughter who would serve as a soft, pretty background element to Julian's bright and loud future, a girl who knew how to charm the elite families of Savannah without ever expressing an original thought. Julian learned very early how to feed into their vanity by becoming the face of the family through carefully curated videos and social media posts that made him look like a visionary entrepreneur. In reality, he was merely spending our grandfather Silas's hard-earned wealth on vanity projects and failed tech startups that never turned a single cent of profit. My parents moved money behind the scenes for years to keep the illusion of his success alive, convinced that Julian was the only one capable of carrying the Sterling name into the modern era. The only person who ever saw through the polished veneer of our family was Grandpa Silas, a man who had built his shipping and logistics empire with grit and a terrifyingly sharp mind. One afternoon when I was 14, he had found me sitting in the corner of his dusty home office, trying to fix a broken laptop I had found in a thrift store with my own saved chore money. Instead of telling me to go outside or find a more feminine hobby, he had sat down in his creaky leather chair and watched me work for 3 straight hours without saying a single word. When I finally got the machine to hum to life, his eyes hadn't filled with the bored condescension I was used to from my father. They had sparkled with a genuine predatory intelligence. He told me that most people looked at the world and saw things, but people like us looked at the world and saw the invisible threads that connected everything together. Silas started bringing me old ledgers from his business, asking me to find the inefficiencies that his high-paid consultants had missed, and he treated my findings with the respect of a professional partner. My parents absolutely hated our bond, frequently interrupting our sessions to drag me away to some debutante rehearsal or a social event where I was expected to look beautiful and say nothing. My mother would often remark that Silas was filling my head with nonsense that would make me socially stunted, while my father worried that I was becoming too much like the old man in his most stubborn years. I remember the last Christmas I was allowed to spend with Silas before the walls of silence were fully erected by my parents and my brother to keep me away from his influence. Silas had grown frail, his hands shaking as he held his tea, but his mind remained a fortress that Julian could never hope to breach, regardless of how many business degrees he claimed to have. My brother had spent that entire evening filming a vlog about the Sterling family legacy, forcing Silas to sit under hot studio lights while Julian talked about how he would take the company to the next level. I stood in the hallway watching the way my grandfather's jaw tightened every time Julian referred to the shipping business as a personal playground for his influencer lifestyle. Later that night, when the house was finally quiet and the camera crews were gone, Silas called me into his room and handed me a small encrypted flash drive he had hidden inside a hollowed-out book. He told me that the world was changing, and that my parents were too blinded by their own greed to see the rot that was beginning to eat away at the foundations of what he had built. He whispered that he had been watching the way they were using his accounts to fund Julian's endless failures, and he knew they would eventually try to push me out of the family to secure their grip. Silas made me promise that I would keep building my own life in Chicago, that I would never beg them for a seat at a table built on lies, and that I would wait for the moment when the data spoke for itself. As I sat in that conference room years later looking at the $45 million documents that Julian was now clutching with trembling fingers, I realized Silas had been preparing for this day for over a decade. He had seen the way my mother had begun to filter his mail, the way my father had started signing documents on his behalf, and the way Julian had turned his final illness into a content series. My mother had told everyone in Savannah that I was too busy with my cold, heartless career to visit a dying man, while in reality, she was the one who had changed the security codes on the estate. She had told the nurses that I was a source of stress for Silas, and she had intercepted every single letter I sent, ensuring that my grandfather felt abandoned by his only granddaughter. I had sent dozens of handwritten notes and made hundreds of phone calls that were redirected to a voicemail I knew he would never hear all, while they were painting me as the villain of the family. They believed that by isolating him and erasing my presence from his daily life, they could force Silas to sign away the entirety of his legacy to the son who would keep their social status intact. The most painful part of this betrayal was realizing that my parents didn't just want the money. They wanted to destroy the memory of the relationship I had with the only man who truly loved me. They wanted to replace my genuine connection with Silas with a fabricated narrative where Julian was the devoted successor and I was the cold-hearted outsider who only cared about her paycheck. My father once told me during a brief phone call that I didn't have the sterling spirit, implying that my preference for hard work and quiet observation was somehow inferior to Julian's talent for self-promotion. He didn't realize that Silas valued my spirit precisely because it wasn't for sale, and because I was the only one who didn't look at him and see a walking bank account. Silas knew that the shipping company was struggling under the weight of my father's poor management and Julian's constant spending, and he knew that giving them more money would only accelerate the collapse. He had spent his final years working in secret with Daniel Park to ensure that his true life's work would be protected from the very people who claimed to be his primary caretakers. Every time Julian posted a video of himself laughing with a confused-looking Silas, my heart broke, but I remained silent because I knew that my grandfather was playing a much longer game than any of them could comprehend. The injustice of those years spent in exile in Chicago was a heavy burden to carry, especially when I saw my family celebrating holidays and milestones as if I had never existed at all. I would see photos of their lavish parties and their exotic vacations, knowing that my grandfather was likely sitting alone in his room, wondering why I hadn't come to see him. It was a calculated form of psychological warfare designed to make me give up and disappear, leaving the field open for them to claim everything Silas had built over 60 years of hard labor. They underestimated my patience, and they certainly underestimated the meticulous nature of the man who had raised me in the shadows of his own office. Silas understood that the best way to catch a thief is to let them believe they have already gotten away with the crime, and he had provided me with the tools to prove their treachery when the time was right. I sat there in the conference room, my eyes fixed on my mother's pale face, and I felt a sense of calm that only comes when you know the truth is about to be revealed. The $45 million was a drop in the bucket compared to the secrets Daniel was about to read from that black envelope, and I was finally ready to reclaim my place in the story they had tried so hard to finish without me. What do you think about parents who would go to such lengths to isolate a child just to ensure a larger inheritance for their favorite? And have you ever felt like the black sheep in your own family for simply being different? Please share your stories in the comments because it is time we stop letting people like the Sterlings define our worth based on how well we fit into their narrow, selfish world. Don't forget to hit the like button if you believe that every child deserves to be seen for who they truly are, and stay tuned for the next part, where the secrets behind the Sterling fortune finally come to light. The atmosphere in the conference room grew increasingly suffocating as the realization began to dawn on my parents that their carefully constructed wall of lies was starting to crumble under the weight of the black envelope Daniel was holding. I watched my mother, Margaret Sterling, reach for her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she had whenever a situation slipped beyond her meticulous control, while my father, Richard, stared at the lawyer as if he were an intruder in his own home. They had spent the last 3 years of Grandpa Silas's life convincing the world that they were the ultimate martyrs, sacrificing their personal lives to care for a man who they claimed was losing his grip on reality. Julian Sterling had been the primary architect of this digital illusion, using his social media platforms to broadcast a highly edited version of our grandfather's decline to hundreds of thousands of strangers. He would post videos of himself sitting by Silas's bedside, holding the old man's hand and whispering platitudes about family loyalty, while the camera was positioned at just the right angle to capture the expensive medical equipment and the luxurious surroundings. What the followers didn't see was the way Julian would stand up and check his reflection in the mirror the second the recording stopped, or the way he would complain about the smell of the sick room as soon as he thought the microphone was off. He turned our grandfather's vulnerability into a marketing tool for his own personal brand, gaining followers and sponsorship deals by playing the role of the devoted grandson who was carrying the emotional weight of a crumbling dynasty. Whenever I tried to call the house during those months, I was met with a wall of administrative staff and nurses who had been instructed by my mother to tell me that Silas was either sleeping or too agitated to speak with visitors. I would spend my nights in Chicago staring at Julian's Instagram stories, watching my grandfather's confused eyes as he was prodded to smile for a selfie, feeling a sense of helplessness that threatened to consume me. My mother had gone so far as to hire a public relations consultant to ensure that the narrative of my abandonment was solidified in the minds of the Savannah social elite. She told everyone who would listen that I had chosen the cold, impersonal world of Chicago data firms over the warmth of my family, and that I hadn't even bothered to send a card for my grandfather's last birthday. In reality, I had sent a hand-painted card filled with references to the logic puzzles Silas and I used to solve together, along with a specialized tablet I had programmed to allow him to bypass my mother's communication filters. I later discovered through a sympathetic housekeeper that Julian had intercepted the package and thrown the tablet into the fireplace, claiming to Silas that it was just more junk mail from a debt collector. They were not just stealing money. They were systematically erasing my presence from the mind of a dying man, ensuring that he felt truly alone, so that he would be more dependent on their version of reality. My father played his part by managing the financial side of the deception, slowly transferring assets out of the Sterling shipping accounts and into personal trusts controlled by Julian under the guise of estate planning. He believed that as long as Silas was alive and ostensibly cared for, no one would ever question where the money was going or why the company's reserves were dwindling so rapidly. One of the most chilling aspects of their deception was the way they used Silas's own words against him during the rare moments when he tried to assert his will. If he asked for me, my mother would sigh with a practiced sadness and tell him that I had been invited, but was unfortunately too busy with a high-stakes merger to make the trip down south. She would show him edited screenshots of my social media posts from years ago, claiming they were current to make it look like I was out partying while he was struggling to breathe. I remember seeing one particular video Julian posted where Silas looked directly into the lens and asked, "Where is my Ellie for the whole world to see?" Julian had simply laughed and told him that Ellie was in the big city now and didn't have time for old stories anymore, a comment that garnered thousands of likes and sympathetic comments from people who didn't know the truth. The level of calculated cruelty required to mislead an elderly man about the love of his only granddaughter is something I still struggle to comprehend even after all my years of analyzing human behavior through data. As Silas's health worsened, the greed of my family seemed to accelerate in direct proportion to his frailty, leading them to make mistakes that they were too arrogant to notice. They became so confident in their control over his environment that they began to discuss their financial maneuvers right in front of him, assuming that his silence meant he was no longer capable of understanding the technical details. They didn't realize that Silas had been a shark in the world of logistics for 50 years, and his mind was still functioning like a high-speed processor even when his body was failing him. He began to keep a mental tally of every luxury car Julian bought with business funds, and every designer gown my mother purchased for a gala, while claiming the estate was tight on cash. Silas knew that the $45 million he had left in the primary will was exactly what they expected to find, a sum large enough to keep them satisfied, but small enough to act as a decoy for his true intentions. He had spent his final months feigning a level of confusion that allowed him to gather evidence against them, working quietly with Daniel Park whenever my parents were away at their social functions. The turning point came when I tried one last time to visit the estate without an appointment, hoping to catch a moment of honesty before it was too late. I was met at the front gate by Julian, who stood there with 2 security guards and a look of pure malice on his face that he never showed to his online audience. He told me that I was no longer welcome on Sterling property, and that if I didn't leave immediately, he would have me arrested for trespassing and harassment of a vulnerable senior. He laughed when I tried to show him the flight records of my previous attempts to visit, telling me that it didn't matter what the truth was, because everyone already believed his version of the story. The world loves a hero, Eleanor, and they love a villain even more. He had sneered at me before signaling the guards to close the heavy iron gates. I sat in my rental car in the rain watching the lights of my grandfather's wing flicker in the distance, knowing that he was only a few hundred yards away, but might as well have been on another planet. That was the moment I realized that my family was no longer a family. They were a predatory organization that had decided I was an obstacle to be removed at any cost. What they didn't know was that Daniel Park was already in possession of the tablet I had tried to send, and he had managed to smuggle it to Silas during a late-night legal consultation that my parents had dismissed as routine. For the last 6 weeks of his life, Silas had been recording everything, not just his thoughts, but the actual conversations that took place in his room when the cameras weren't rolling. He captured my mother's sharp, demanding tone as she pushed him to sign blank checks, and he recorded Julian's boasts about how he was going to sell off the shipping company the moment the old man finally let go. This digital archive was the foundation of the black envelope that now sat on the table, a silent witness to 1,000 betrayals that were about to be broadcast to the very people who thought they were in total control. My father's attempt to laugh off the existence of a second document was a desperate act of denial, a final attempt to maintain the illusion that he was the master of this house. I looked at my mother and saw her fingers trembling as she tried to maintain her regal posture, the cracks in her mask finally becoming visible to everyone in the room. She had built her entire identity on being the devoted daughter-in-law and the perfect mother, but she was about to be revealed as a woman who had sold her soul for a share of a $45 million inheritance. Julian was still trying to look unimpressed, but the way he kept glancing at his phone suggested he was already thinking about the damage control he would have to perform if the truth came out. They still believed they could win because they had the numbers and the public sympathy, but they had forgotten that Silas Sterling never lost a fight, and he certainly wasn't going to start now. The silence in the room was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin, a heavy electric tension that signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a long-awaited reckoning. As Daniel reached into the envelope to pull out a small metallic device that looked like a high-tech media player, my father finally lost his composure and demanded to know what was going on. He shouted that this was a private reading and that he would not have his father's memory insulted by some theatrical nonsense prepared by a disgruntled lawyer. Daniel simply looked up at him with a calm, steady gaze and reminded him that the terms of the will were absolute and that Silas had specifically requested this presentation as a condition of the final distribution. I felt a surge of adrenaline as the lawyer connected the device to the large monitor mounted on the wall, the same monitor my father used for his boardroom meetings. The screen flickered to life, showing a time-stamped video of my grandfather sitting in his chair looking tired but incredibly sharp, with a look in his eyes that I recognized instantly. It was the look he had whenever he was about to close a deal that would ruin his competitors, a look of absolute, unwavering certainty. Do you think a family that uses a dying relative for social media clout deserves to be stripped of their inheritance? And how would you react if you discovered your siblings were blocking you from seeing a parent in their final days? Please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, because your perspective helps bring light to the dark reality that many people face in families driven by greed. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the moment when the video plays, and the secrets that made my mother scream are finally revealed to the world. The large monitor on the wall hummed to life with a sterile blue light that seemed to drain what little color remained in my mother's face as she stared at the flickering pixels. My father, Richard Sterling, made one final attempt to stop the proceedings by reaching for the power cord, but Daniel Park stepped in front of him with a quiet, icy authority that reminded everyone in the room that this was now a legal crime scene. The video stabilized to show Grandpa Silas sitting in his favorite wingback chair, his voice rasping, but his eyes as sharp as two diamond drills, boring into the conscience of every person at the table. He began by stating his full name and the current date, confirming that he was of sound mind and acting under no pressure from anyone except the overwhelming weight of the truth. On the screen, Silas looked directly into the camera lens and spoke about the betrayal he had endured in silence, while my brother Julian was busy filming his scripted heartwarming moments for a digital audience. My grandfather revealed that he had been aware of every single cent my father had funneled out of the shipping company to cover Julian's mounting gambling debts and failed real estate ventures in Florida. He explained with a devastating clarity how he had watched my mother Margaret delete my emails and block my phone number on his personal device, while telling him that I was too busy celebrating my new promotion in Chicago to care about his health. Silas then produced a thick folder of bank statements on camera pointing to the specific transfers that matched the exact dates Julian had posted videos about family unity and cherishing every moment with the elderly. The room was so quiet that I could hear the frantic, shallow breathing of my brother as he realized that his entire online persona was about to be dismantled by the very man he had used as a prop. Silas's voice on the video became stronger as he described the night I had tried to visit the estate only to be turned away by the security guards my father had hired with the estate's own money. He had seen the entire confrontation from his window, watching through his binoculars as Julian sneered at me and forced the gates shut while my grandfather sat trapped in his own home like a prisoner of war. They thought I was a senile old man who couldn't see past the medication they were feeding me, Silas said, with a grim, hollow laugh that echoed through the conference room. He then dropped the biggest bombshell of all, revealing that the $45 million mentioned in the initial will was actually a carefully laid trap designed to expose their true nature. He had deliberately left that specific amount in a joint account that he knew my parents would attempt to seize immediately upon his death, knowing their greed would make them reckless. In reality, the true bulk of the Sterling legacy, including the controlling interest in a secret tech firm called Harbormind Analytics, had already been moved into a private trust in my name years ago. My mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp as Silas began to play audio recordings he had captured on the hidden tablet I had sent him during those final weeks of his life. We heard my mother's voice, cold and demanding, as she told Silas that he was a burden and that he needed to sign over his remaining power of attorney if he wanted to keep seeing the grandchildren Julian had promised to bring over. We heard Julian's voice in the background complaining that the old man was taking too long to die and that he needed the inheritance money to settle a lawsuit from a former business partner before the press found out. My father's voice was the most chilling of all, calmly discussing the logistical details of how they would sell off Silas's beloved vintage car collection before the funeral had even taken place. The recording was undeniable, a raw and brutal portrait of a family that had replaced love with a calculated strategy for financial gain at the expense of a dying man's dignity. Margaret finally snapped, letting out a scream that was less about grief and more about the sudden, terrifying realization that her social status and her fortune were vanishing in real time. She lunged toward the monitor, shouting that the video was a deep fake, a digital forgery created by my computer nerd brain to steal what she believed was rightfully hers after years of putting up with Silas. My father grabbed her arm, but he looked just as broken, his eyes darting toward the lawyer as if he were looking for a loophole in a contract that was written in blood. Daniel Park didn't move an inch, simply staring at them with a look of profound disgust before sliding a new set of financial disclosures across the table that showed the systematic theft they had committed. The $45 million they had been so eager to claim was now legally frozen, tied up in a forensic audit that would likely lead to criminal charges for elder abuse and grand larceny. Silas had ensured that every cent they had taken without his permission was documented, categorized, and ready to be presented to the district attorney if they dared to contest his final wishes. Julian was staring at his phone, his thumbs moving frantically as he tried to delete the years of fraudulent posts he had made, but it was too late because Daniel had already archived every single one of them for the court. The visionary entrepreneur was now just a petty thief who had used his grandfather's terminal illness to fund a lifestyle he hadn't earned and couldn't maintain. I sat there feeling a strange mixture of immense relief and profound sadness, realizing that Silas had spent his last days fighting a war on my behalf, while I was miles away thinking he had forgotten me. He hadn't been confused or senile. He had been the most focused and strategic version of himself, ensuring that the only person who truly cared about him was the one who would carry on his legacy. The hidden company HarborMind Analytics was worth nearly double the amount Julian had been promised, and it was a firm that focused on exactly what Silas and I used to talk about: using data to protect small businesses from predatory corporations. The video on the screen ended with a final message from Silas, a message directed specifically to me, telling me that he was sorry for the distance, and that he knew I would use the Sterling name for something better than vanity. He told me that I was the architect now, and that the blueprints he had left behind were mine to execute as I saw fit. My mother's screaming had subsided into a low, hysterical sobbing as she realized that the selfish daughter she had tried to erase was now the most powerful person in the room. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the public shame that was about to follow when the details of Silas's final recordings were inevitably leaked to the press. The legal battle they had prepared for was over before it had even begun, because Silas had provided a level of proof that no high-priced attorney could ever hope to challenge in a court of law. I looked at my parents, seeing them clearly for the first time in 32 years, and I realized that I didn't hate them as much as I pitied the small, hollow people they had become in their pursuit of wealth. They had traded a daughter and a grandfather for a pile of money that Silas had turned into a mirage, leaving them stranded in a desert of their own making. Daniel Park began to pack his briefcase, his job finally complete, and he looked at me with a nod of respect that told me I was finally free from the Sterling shadow. The $45 million was a ghost, a distraction that had served its purpose, and the real future was waiting for me in the code and the systems that Silas had entrusted to my hands. The room felt lighter now, as if the ghosts had finally been exorcised by the light of the truth, leaving only the wreckage of a family that had forgotten how to be human. My brother Julian tried to speak, his voice cracking, as he asked if there was any way we could work this out privately, offering me a share of the family image if I would just make the video go away. I didn't even bother to answer him, simply standing up and walking toward the door, knowing that my silence was the most powerful weapon I had left in my arsenal. They had spent years trying to manage my life and my reputation, but now they were the ones who would have to live with the consequences of their own data. The Savannah social circles they cared so much about would soon know every detail of their treachery, and the followers Julian craved so much would turn on him with a ferocity that only the internet can provide. Silas Sterling had won his final deal, and I was the one who was going to make sure the world never forgot the man who had the foresight to protect his true heir from the wolves in his own house. Do you think a parent's love should ever be conditional on how much money a child can bring into a family? And would you be able to forgive your parents if they had committed such a deep betrayal against you and a loved one? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments, because your stories of resilience and survival are what give me the strength to keep moving forward into this new chapter of my life. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we move into the final part of this journey, where the ultimate consequences for the Sterling family are revealed, and I finally find the peace Silas wanted for me. The aftermath of the video presentation felt like the cooling of a scorched earth, where the fire of truth had finally burned away the dense layers of deception that my family had spent years cultivating. I watched as my mother, Margaret Sterling, sat slumped in her chair with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a type of grief that had nothing to do with the loss of Silas and everything to do with the loss of her social standing. My father, Richard, stood motionless by the mahogany table looking down at the frozen $45 million accounts, as if he were staring into an open grave that he had spent his entire life digging. Julian was the first to break the silence, his voice a pathetic whine as he tried to bargain with Daniel Park, offering to sign any document if the lawyer would just promise to keep the recordings out of the public eye. He was already checking his phone to see the first ripples of the scandal, realizing that several of his high-profile sponsors were already pulling their contracts after Daniel had sent the evidence to a select group of investigative journalists. The empire of influence that Julian had built on the back of our grandfather's suffering was disintegrating in real time, and no amount of damage control or filtered apologies could stop the flood of condemnation that was about to arrive. I felt no joy in watching them suffer, only a profound sense of exhaustion and a quiet satisfaction that the man who had raised me in the shadows was finally getting the last word. The legal proceedings that followed over the next several months were as clinical and thorough as the data analysis I had performed throughout my career, leaving no stone unturned in the Sterling family finances. Daniel Park moved with the precision of a surgeon working alongside a team of forensic accountants to claw back every cent my father and Julian had misappropriated during Silas's final years. Because the evidence of elder abuse and financial fraud was so overwhelming, my parents were forced to sell the family estate in Savannah to settle the massive debts and legal penalties that Silas had strategically triggered. The very halls I had walked as a lonely child were now being photographed for real estate listings, and the social circles my mother had worshipped turned their backs on her with a coldness that she had once reserved for me. They were forced to move into a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one knew their names, and where the Sterling legacy was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties they were no longer invited to attend. My father tried to find work as a consultant, but his reputation was so tarnished by the video evidence that no reputable firm would allow him to step foot in their boardroom. Julian's fall was even more spectacular, as the internet he had used to manipulate his followers turned on him with a ferocity that was both terrifying and inevitable in its symmetry. Every video he had ever posted of Silas was scrutinized and parodied, and he was eventually banned from several major platforms for violating their policies on the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. He went from being a pampered prince of Savannah to a man who couldn't walk down the street without hearing people whisper about the grandson who had betrayed his own blood for a paycheck. He tried to start several new business ventures, using what was left of his personal savings. But without the Sterling name and Silas's bottomless accounts, he discovered that he possessed neither the talent nor the work ethic required to survive in the real world. I watched all of this from a distance, never once reaching out to offer them a lifeline, not because I was cruel, but because I knew that any help I gave would only prevent them from finally learning the lesson Silas had intended to teach. As for me, I stepped into my role as the majority shareholder of HarborMind Analytics, with a sense of purpose that made the years of isolation in Chicago feel like a necessary training period for the challenges ahead. The company was exactly what Silas had promised, a powerhouse of logistics and data that focused on ethical business practices and the protection of independent entrepreneurs from predatory interests. I used the resources Silas had left me to establish a foundation dedicated to the protection of senior citizens from financial exploitation, ensuring that no other family would be able to do what mine had done in the dark. I often found myself sitting in Silas's old leather chair in the new office I built, looking at the same flash drive he had given me, and feeling his presence in every decision I made for the future of the company. I realized that my grandfather hadn't just left me money or a business. He had left me the confirmation that being different was my greatest strength, and that logic was the ultimate shield against the chaos of human greed. The $45 million that had been the center of my family's world was eventually donated to various charities and legal aid clinics, as I wanted no part of the blood money that had caused so much pain. Looking back on the day of the will reading, I realized that the most important thing I inherited wasn't the controlling interest in a tech firm or the physical assets of an empire. It was the freedom to be Eleanor Sterling without the weight of my parents' expectations or the shadow of my brother's narcissism hanging over every breath I took. I learned that family isn't defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the loyalty and respect that you show to one another when there is nothing left to gain from the relationship. Silas knew that the only way to save me was to let me go, and the only way to punish them was to give them exactly what they thought they wanted until it became their own prison. I am no longer the ghost haunting the corridors of a Savannah estate. I am the architect of a new legacy, one built on the foundations of truth and the unwavering power of the data that my grandfather and I loved so much. My life in Chicago is now filled with people who value me for my mind and my character, and I have found a sense of peace that my mother and father will never be able to understand in their small, bitter world. Thank you for listening to my story and for staying with me until the very end of this long and difficult journey through the wreckage of my past. If you have ever been treated like you were invisible, or if you have ever been pushed out of your own family for choosing to be yourself, I hope my story gives you the courage to keep building your own path. Remember that your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who is holding all the cards. If you believe that truth should always have a voice, and that justice is worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support helps me share these stories of resilience and ensures that voices like mine and Silas's are never silenced by the greed of others. Please leave a comment below telling me the most important lesson you have learned from this story, and don't forget to hit the like button to help this message reach someone who might need to hear it today. Until next time, stay strong, stay logical, and never let